I think we are off and running. Welcome to what is a very special On The Way event here on the On The Way Facebook page. You've probably heard the podcast, I'm guessing, if you're on this Facebook page, where we do explore matters of life, faith and meaning from a non-dualistic, non-violent and compassionate perspective. My name is Dom Fay. At the moment, I'm here on a Zoom chat with a screen full of priests, which is quite a thing to be doing on a Friday afternoon at the moment as we're recording. I do have Reverend Sue Grimmett and the very Reverend Dr. Peter Catt, as always, with me Zooming in. Thanks for making time, guys.
And good to be here with visuals too.
Yeah,
excellent. Nice to see everyone.
Well, before I introduce our next two guests, Peter, what's the Zoom background you're rocking with there? What's that one?
Mine is a little photo taken on our walk in Italy a few years ago. It's part of my current grieving process because my Italian holiday this year isn't going to happen. So I'm torturing myself by reliving previous Italian holidays.
Brilliant.
It's part of the COVID experience of self-flagellation.
A bit of a virtual holiday. Well, we're welcoming our other two priests here today. We have Reverend Deb Bird and Reverend Claye Middleton. Deb and Claye, thank you for joining in this Zoom chat.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
We might before we jump into, because what we're hoping to do here is sort of discuss some of the themes of our latest episode about the death of Christendom. If you have heard the episode, this will flow on nicely from it. If you haven't, maybe this will be a nice introduction to the ideas we discuss in it. We just thought it'd be good to keep the conversation going. Just briefly before we get into that though, Deb, I might start with you. Can you give us a background, I guess, on who you are and what you do?
Okay. I'm a priest. I'm based in Toowoomba at the moment. I've got a background in arts and education. Got some girls who are actually in the painting behind me. That was a friend's painting that they did for me ages ago. I guess I like to be involved in the conversation about what's emerging at the moment. It's been a very, of course, interesting few months that we've been through that I've struggled with at various times, and at other times I've sat back fascinated to see what's emerging. So I'm delighted to be invited into this conversation.
And Claye, what about you? What's your background?
Yep. So I'm a priest at the moment in around the areas of Burpengary, Deception Bay and Narangba. It's a beautiful north side of Brisbane. My background before that really was just a musician. So I used to play gigs and bands and all that kind of jazz. And I was also a barista, highly skilled, highly paid role, which was fun. So that's really but basically my background, I guess. And like Deb, really, I just really enjoy these kind of discussions, talking about what sort of mess we're in, which is always fun and wonderful, and seeing if we can sit happily within that mess and make comments on it.
So obviously a lot has changed this year in so many realms, and the latest podcast is talking about how it might accelerate a bunch of big changes, I guess, in what Christendom has been since about 300 AD, as we do speak about on the podcast. I just as a note to start with, I suppose, Sue, we should mention that this was originally meant to be the podcast, the five of us. That was the idea. That was sort of the conversations that emerged. Some scheduling difficulties made that a little bit harder. So it's great to have you both with us, Deb and Claye. Just to set the context again, so for those who mightn't have heard the podcast, can you talk a bit about what this idea is and where it's emerged from in your thinking?
Well, I think we all come at this in different ways, but I've noticed when we think about what has been revealed during COVID, some of the power structures seem to have been unbalanced or else revealed to be quite kind of overt and naked power plays by both people in government, but also in the church. I think we sort of can sit back and have a look at power structures that are now meaningless because of when we're sitting at home and reflecting on what Christianity is really all about. It kind of just brings to the fore what I talked about in the podcast, was how it's really about this community of friends and generous hospitality, and some of the attachments of culture, including the kind of strong patriarchal thread that's flowed through for the church and the institution, are really not what it's all about, and they are really shown up to be meaningless across this time.
Yeah, I might bring you into this then, Deb. You did ask me before we recorded, don't throw to you first. I've thrown to you second there, so we can work with that. But I'll bring you into this. Obviously, this is something that the four of you have chatted about in differing forms, to some extent. How do you see this topic?
This topic, I've been fascinated through this time, as Sue has said. It's been a real time of revealing for me. That everyone has been pushed to some extent, out of our churches and into a much more public forum. So while I think what it revealed initially was not any sense of change, but what we already were. The diversity among us, and some of the ways we agree and didn't expect to agree, and some of the ways we don't agree across the realm of what we call Christianity today. So it's been a great unveiling of where everybody stands. But I had a great reaction, a terrible reaction actually, initially on the first Sunday when churches went online. And I remember getting home. My church had done one more church service the very last weekend that we could, and I got home and I opened up Facebook and I looked at all these church services and I looked at all these people talking into cameras telling me stuff, and I went, oh my goodness, we've become content. And I'm going, and so the question for me initially, is that what we've always been? Have we always considered ourselves as voices and content, and we've just been seeking ways to push it out there? Or have we actually been successful in forming community behind that? And I think the revealing has said both. There are places where, for me, I've been delighted to discover that Christianity has been the place of belonging that has produced community that has endured the separation of the recent months. But there's also those parts that are the things that I most feared, the Christianity that is still out there talking and not listening, that's still out there saying this is a list of things to be handed down. It is Christianity that's demanding to be heard in places of power. And I think that's become even more obvious than what I feared it was to begin with. So, I hear the word apocalypse thrown around a lot at the moment, and I agree completely. There's been a great many things that have been exposed and we can look at clearly now.
Would that reflect your experiences, Claye, as well? Have you observed similar things, some slightly different things? Is the themes similar throughout?
Yeah, I think so. I think the initial feeling for most of us was just this kind of uncomfortableness about what's going on. I mean, we were all forced into a new way of doing things, and I think we scrambled to find meaning in that, or to at least put some words or framework around how meaning works in that space. So I think Deb's really given a good rundown of how that felt for me as well, and many of us. It was interesting to see the different discussions that started going on in the church amongst laity, but also amongst clergy. These great big discussions and theological kind of to and fro's that were happening about the Eucharist and all those kind of things, which was interesting because we no longer had the comfort of being able to sit back over years knowing that we could do what we usually do on a Sunday anyway and have these great big theological discussions and then trickle that down to our people. All of a sudden, it was urgent. Things are changing now. And we need to, at times, realize that we actually prioritized people and community over perfect theology or being right theologically and liturgically at times. So as Deb was saying, I think that was in a sense, a great theological apocalypse, because it was kind of unveiling a lot of things, and we just didn't have that luxury of sitting back and arguing over these concepts over and over again. We had to realize our people need something now. We need to support the community now and find how we can grow it in a way that we're not comfortable with, actually. And I mean grow in a sense of depth.
I found your comment, Deb, really interesting about how is the church just content now, in the sense that you know, to many people in many churches, probably, you know, pastors around the world, priests around the world would probably think that is their main job, is, you know, what they're delivering, what the Sunday morning show is, you know, and that's probably just grown and grown as time has gone on and church maybe become to look a bit more like culture. What if you could paint what the alternative clearly looks like? I mean, clearly might be a hard ask, but what does the alternative to church being content look like in a, you know, in a weekly gathering or I guess a faith community?
It's a place of belonging and participation, I think, is the opposite to content. It's a place where we, as Claye was saying, we make meaning between us. You know, I don't know that in, you know, the bit that disturbed me about the conversations that started rising that Claye was alluding to was the great grasping for deciding what is right, what is the right way to proceed. You know, I'm right and I'm really disturbed about what else everyone else is doing. It must be wrong, you know. You know, I think the opposite of content, sitting back and waiting to see how we can make meaning between us. I think it's something that involves us all. I think it's something that can't be hurried. I think you know, the practice of time and patience and togetherness are all ingredients that we simply can't do without. You know, and it's wrapped up in remembering who we are in story. You know, it's wrapped up in retelling our stories and saying, where do we find ourselves in this story today? It's a place we haven't been before. So where are we sitting in the story now? I don't think there's an answer that I can articulate with any sort of clarity at all, other than it's only something we can do together. And we can't decide it now for all time, you know, which is the other resistance I have to Christianity, the deciding now for all time what this must be.
I guess there's going to be people watching this, some of who maybe were regular churchgoers before COVID and maybe haven't been back, you know, in the limited ways that some people have been able to gather yet, but maybe plan to down the track. There'll be others who, you know, I know some friends who have been going to certain churches who said that not being forced to go almost anymore on a Sunday kind of felt like they realized they weren't really missing all that much, that not having that Sunday performance sort of wasn't that much of an absence for them. And then there's the other side of it. There's people who maybe will be pushed into trying to explore a lot of this stuff because of what COVID has unveiled in their own lives on the other side of this, who maybe beforehand matters of faith and deeper meaning weren't particularly front of mind. So if we've and I know this has been the conversation from the first week of the pandemic, has been, how will things change? Not back to normal, but, you know, to use the phrase that the Democratic candidate Joe Biden's using in America, building back better. What's going to be different on the other side? How can we implement lessons that have been learned here? Peter, what do you think, I guess, as someone who does lead the cathedral precinct, of how when things do return, you know, and they're trickling back a little bit now where we live, but on a bigger scale, how can things be imagined differently?
Well, a lot of that is yet to be revealed, which is why I like to sit and see what's emerging. Some of the things I can see emerging are that community really matters. I've been in conversation with a number of clergy across the nation, and some of them have been devastated to discover that their community had almost no attachment. There was almost no attachment of people who he thought or they thought were part of their community. People have just left, money's gone. Other people have discovered that community was really strong and robust. And I think that's going to provide an ongoing challenge for us to ensure that it is about people and gathering people and us nurturing one another. And I think that's the thing that has made it tolerable for me during the COVID experience, because, you know, particularly in the early days when we were limited to 5 people at a time in church buildings, the liturgy really became priest-centric. The hero priest, all the stuff that we've been trying to overcome for a long time, it became really focused on the priest. And in some places, they did away with all liturgical action altogether and replaced it with a talking head that was just that person. No way of involving other people at all, and which is exactly the opposite to what liturgy. Liturgy is the work of the people, and if it crashes back to being one person, usually a male, talking at people, then the whole thing is crashed in on itself. And the thing that made it really tolerable for me was that whilst we were doing liturgy in that way, which I found really quite disturbing and only continued with because people were saying that the gift of the familiar was keeping them sane. The thing that actually made it sustainable for me was the fact that we spent far more time having coffee groups, study groups, reflection groups, meditation groups, places where the people could be the gathered community despite the fact they couldn't be gathered. And that was the thing that held it together. And I think a lot of communities will be called upon in this time to make sure that what they've been doing is true community life. And it's not, a Bible study is not a community unless the people feel like they're engaged with each other. So it's not about content. It's not about providing people with study notes or prayer points or anything like that. It's about how we make sure people are being able to be vulnerable to each other, nurture one another, support one another, hear one another's stories, and have the freedom that I think the gospel is all about to be their true self. Because in some places I know people have, one of the reasons why people have fled from community is that they've actually discovered the opportunity to be free from something that was actually inhibiting them. And Christianity needs to constantly be on the watch out for the idealized Christian and tight sort of form of testimony that actually conforms people into particular ways of expression. Whereas, the original intention of the way, as we often talk about, was to build communities of people who broke bread. And that's become really problematic for us. So we have to find ways to actually stay in communion with each other, but actually were there for each other. Was the transforming gift of the gospel was to overcome division. And so how we make sure that that's what we're doing going forward, that's the challenge, I think.
I think absolutely. I think the reason why this is revealed so much too is a combination of what you've been saying here, that, Deb talking about we have to work it out together, that this idea that we had content that we could just deliver, or that there was one right way of doing this and that other people were wrong, is totally the Christendom model all over again. That there is this is the way of it, of the truth is packaged up, we're going to pass it over to you, and this is the correct way it can be passed over. And it's the exact opposite to tuning into your people, which has meant for us doing some things that we're uncomfortable with, like working through the liturgy with a few of us and looking at all those empty pews, because for no other reason, but because people were in touch with us and saying, at home, we are sitting there, we're watching this, that prayer for spiritual communion, I'm reflecting on, and some people had said, for the first time, I'm really having to go, right, it's me here. I have got to engage and do the seeking actively myself here at home using this. And so they had written and said, we feel connected to you when you do this. And so whether we felt uncomfortable or not doing it was sort of beside the point, because our community was saying, this is something that's helping us at the moment. But as Deb said, it's not for all time. Yeah. At the moment, this is what was needed. And this is the exact opposite, the working out as a community of friends, how we live together in loving community is a dynamic, movable feast.
I'm intrigued by your phrase of the Christendom model there, Sue, this idea that many people throughout the past, well, let's say 1700 years, have stumbled into these secrets, into this way of living, into this wisdom, and found so much life here. and yet again and again keep thinking the way to handle this life-giving message, the way to pass it on, is to go back to that Christendom model of I'll stand up the front, you all sit in front of me, I'll speak for 50 to 60 minutes perhaps, you can buy my book out the front, and then off we go. That seems to be the model we keep falling back into. It seems to be the only model we know of delivering any kind of message, I guess, at a core level. Do you think that's just a cultural thing? Do you think that's something of human nature? Why is it that we keep falling back into the Christendom model?
I think it's all sorts of things. Personally, I think, the model of capitalism that we grow up into teaches us that we don't have the answer or the solution ourselves, and we are to shop around for it. We are to look elsewhere for it. So if someone's willing to write a book and provide it, but I also think it's something, I noticed in the podcast you touched a little bit on the, we talk about the nature of God all the time, but the flip side of that is we have to talk about the nature of humanity. And if we're peddling a version of Christianity that says God is waiting for us to mess up, then the nature of humanity that we're talking about is that we can't trust ourselves. We don't have the answers. We can't work out our theology for ourselves, which has been, as Sue said, the great opportunity of this time is we've provided familiar patterns, but people have had a bit more space to work out how this means in the situation they find themselves in for themselves, and I think learning that we can do that, we have space to do that, is a more liberating Christianity, and it's one that will stick. It's one that we find authentic, ultimately, the stuff that we can dig into ourselves and find truth for ourselves in against our own experience and in our own story.
I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have to go against the initial instinct. The first instinct is to go to content. The first instinct is to, I've got this, leave it to me, I'll do the right thing and others can just follow along. And you're right, I think that is sort of ingrained in us from just about, early primary school maybe onwards, this idea that you listen to the person in charge, and then one day you maybe become the person in charge, and that's always the model, that power is always involved in it. How, maybe I'll ask this one to you, Peter, what are the moments in your life and your ministry where you have seen a different, even glimpsed a different power balance, a different approach to that deeply ingrained top-down model?
In the flourishing of individuals who come see, it's often best seen, I think, most often see it, is in people who are coming for baptism, who have been drawn by some experience that they want to honour. So they haven't been convinced by an argument or even a crisis. It's not that they've had something go wrong with their life, but there's some transcendent moment which is so precious to them they want to honour it, and they come to the church thinking that the church might be the place where they actually have that experience validated. And if we are wise enough and humble enough to sit at their feet and to listen to what they bring, and to celebrate the gifts that they bring, then everyone experiences a deep form of liberation, because we get a gift that sort of touches our own experience, our own spiritual experience, and they get a validation which literally says, we actually think that God's been at work in your life in a unique and wonderful way, and we want to celebrate that with you. And then the quest becomes, what is it to be you? So how are you going to use your unique set of gifts, talents, and capacities to be a gift to the world, and how are we going to serve you in that process? And I think it's one of the things that actually keeps me in the church is the number of people who actually present themselves with that experience and come as a gift to us. And we are at our best when we actually say, wow, that's fantastic, tell me more. And it's one of the things I really try not to do in the first encounter with such a person is to give them any content at all. But to sit with the content they bring. And often they come thinking that my job is to give them content. And the challenge for me is to resist the shortcut and to sit with their experience and get them to tell me their experience and to validate it by just saying thank you. And then asking them a question. I've taught myself to ask the question when I'm talking to a seeker, and that is, what do you seek, basically, and what can we do to help you find what you seek? What do you want of us? Not because they often come and say, what do I have to do? And it's very tempting to fall into answering that. Well, but tell me your story and how can we help you explore what you've already experienced. And it takes a lot of discipline, I have to say, to sit with that space because of the culture, which is about creedal statements, Bibles, being read in a particular way, all of that, and resisting the temptation.
Yeah, I just thinking about it now, and I can imagine that would be a almost daily or weekly struggle, in that sort of a role, is that you're the person who's trained theologically, you're the person who, undoubtedly has seen so many stories before of people who've been on journeys and what's helped them and what hasn't, and that fixer mentality, I can fix this. You need this book, or, you need to come to this thing on Tuesdays and Fridays, or whatever it is, that whole desire that you're basically the mechanic and they're the car and you can go to work. How hard is that to acknowledge and surrender every day in the work as a priest?
I think it's a big, for me, it's not so much, it was a very big challenge in the early days because when I was first ordained, we were very much into the program, and there were the sort of the 10-week how to become a Christian kits you could take off the shelf, and every time we went to a clergy school, someone had the next best, beautist variety of it, which was meant to solve the problems of the church. And so it was a huge challenge in the early days because there really was this idea of, and it wasn't so much about the cars and mechanics, it was about, here is our sausage machine, you're the mince, and we're going to put you in the top end here, and you're going to come out looking like all these other lovely shiny ones. And it was really about conforming people to a model of what a Christian was. And I think that's one of the things that's been magnificently disrupted in these COVID times, is because people have been forced into isolation, they've also been forced to actually work out what it is for them to exercise their faith. And they aren't sausages.
I suppose one of the reasons I'm asking that particular question is because it occurs to me that we can talk about this as like an abstract concept of the death of Christendom and the different power structures that could, or what a different power structure, I guess, could look like in a sense. But I'm mindful of the fact that in our tradition is that core idea of looking inward before looking outward, that idea of where is that in me before where is that in the culture. And I just wonder, as people who are also passionately committed to this idea, of finding a different way to be together, but who have no doubt at stages, as you've shared, being co-opted into a culture of content-heavy, top-down leadership. How difficult is it to live out the alternative, that you so firmly believe in, when it's almost like a deeply ingrained bad habit is to actually live into it? How difficult is it from a personal level in your individual work? I might ask you, Clay, for example.
Can I make a confession to you, Dom, which I need to do right now?
Yeah.
I was one of the Talking Heads, right? Not that fantastic band from the 80s. I wish I was them. I'm talking about the Talking Heads that Peter was talking about. So one of my many failings is at the beginning of this whole pandemic thing, and I think it speaks deeply into what we're talking about. I was completely pulled that way straight away. I mean, I just sort of clicked into that. The idea of giving content, of being the one who has to show some kind of leadership and be up the front and be talking, hopefully not at people, but at least giving that kind of teaching, inverted commas, to people. And it was just coming face to face with your own ego, or my own ego, really, which is always good to be reminded of, I think. Potentially it's much bigger in myself, but when you come face to face with your own ego in that way, I think that is the inward work that you begin to do. But certainly I found that, and for the first couple of weeks that was my reality. But there's something within you, hopefully, that just starts getting very uncomfortable with that, or there's a twinge or an itch where you think, this isn't right, this just doesn't fit, and then you start inviting other people actually to take up roles, and supporting others to have their voice heard, or maybe to change the shape of what you're doing, what you've set up, and then all of a sudden there's community, there's sharing, there's pouring out our heart and souls, and through that process, just 3 days ago, I got somebody who emailed in their spiritual journey who's quite new to connecting back into the church, and it was this beautiful one-pager of struggle, and of honesty, and of finding a home again back within the church that had hurt that person previously. So I mean, I'd echo everything that everybody else has said, but it is uncomfortable when you see yourself drawn into that, and the sort of sausage thing, factory, machine, butchery is still happening. I mean, absolutely. I get this sort of cartoonish image in my head of when I remember when I first started seeing people who were coming, presenting for baptism, and this cartoon comes into my head where I'm sitting at a desk, and then all of a sudden there's just these mound of books on the desk, and I'm looking up, and this is all the content I should be giving them. And then somebody else will walk through the door and say, "Hey, have you heard about this new process of catechism or whatever?" And all of a sudden you're content machines again. And I'm at the very beginning of this, I guess, whereas Peter is much wiser and along the road. And so we're still having, right in the middle of this battle still. So I think prayer actually has a lot to do with transforming our communities. And I'm certainly not talking about asking God for something, petitioning God, manipulating God, telling God what God is, trying to win God over. I'm talking about the kind of prayer that rejects that God, that actually makes you sit maybe in wonder or in silence, refusing to ask, and just laying yourself bare, just being brutally honest without words. That kind of contemplation, that kind of prayer, if we can share that, I don't say teach it, because if we teach our own version of that, it's just going to be our own version of that pushed into someone else. But if we can invite people into that space and share that, then prayer will start actually changing the way that we relate to God, which then, of course, changes the way we relate to each other and to the world. Christendom cannot exist in that paradigm.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. And I guess what we have now is the greatest collective opportunity, in a sense, that we've had in a very long time, because something else has stopped. And sometimes when something else stops, a bit of a space is created for something new, as I think you were all saying kind of earlier, that idea that when you could rest on the Sunday morning thing every week, and that was always going to be there, and it was always going to be something that could just keep happening, it kind of was hard to maybe have the space to imagine a whole new way of doing things, but perhaps that space has been created now. Do you feel, Sue, I mean, in your work, in your parish, do you feel like that space to imagine has been created?
Yeah, I've struggled for personal space. I think it's been such a busy time for clergy, and which is why the meditation, we actually, the one thing that I'm really grateful I did was put morning prayer on every day with meditation, because it's the only time. And it's amazing how often, I mean, I was just, even though meditation is a time when you're not meant to be distracted thinking about things, but of course we all do still get distracted and think about things. And we'd been talking, people had been emailing through, like Claye was talking about, starting to, you know, email through personal stories or things that they'd found, great poetry, lovely prayers. And as I was sitting in meditation the other day, and this, you know, you know, we say a prayer word over and over again, but my mind started drifting off, and I was thinking about the idea of the commons, that word of the commons. And it probably had come up because I'd stopped for long enough to just be still and for ideas to bubble up. And I thought, why people are emailing me? We can create commons online. You know, we have a sense of the commons in a church community, a parish community, in the physical space. They belong to everyone. So people come and use them for different things, and we work together to maintain the space. Why not have a virtual commons as well, where people don't have to email me, but something they want to share to the community, we can just use, which is at the moment as simple as the Google Drive, but could possibly develop more into like a virtual commons idea. And I just, you know, I think the ways of how do we, because when we talk about Christendom, essentially the key concept we're swirling around is power. How do we devolve power so that we can be community together? And I know that I've worked in schools, and what Clay's describing of that temptation of getting up and talking, and I have that every day because I was a teacher, and teachers get taught to deliver content. And even though, you know, the best teaching strategies would be for children to learn themselves and to find and to create their own learning pathways, so much of it still is institutionalized. And I eventually, and I had to get out of schools because that controlling hierarchical institutional structure, I felt, was so damaging for many young people. And I felt like I was working as part of something that was actively damaging them. So bullying, for instance, I think thrives in institutional settings, because I went to prisons, and when I was working in prisons, what do you know, it felt just like lunch, the playground at lunchtime, when I would go out to when the prisoners were walking around. The same power dynamics were going on, the same bullying you know. And I think our institutions, when they are in that pyramid form, create work against personal empowerment, as we've talked about. The freedoms disappear, and neither do we have space when we're just following what we're told to do. So prayer opens it up, but it is a constant. Sorry, Dom, I've forgotten the question you actually asked me. But you know, I do think that opening up of space, silence, does create then the possibility for something new that is more collaborative to open up.
It is funny as you say that. It does occur to me how strong the ego is, and how creative and clever the ego is, because I can even notice in the back of my mind that desire to go, oh yes, I will surrender to all this and work in a community model of faith, and then I'll be wiser down that front, or whatever it might be down that way. And again, it's almost like a new method to attain power, to attain authority, wisdom, whatever it wants to call itself. It's almost like you trying to use the new model to find a way to actually get to the top. And I think I heard someone say, I don't remember who it was, a few years ago, that in a capitalist Christian culture, a lot of people have used the last shall be first and put themselves last as a method of getting to the top, in a sense. Which I think is kind of, you know, it can be that pervasive. So I suppose then, if we're talking about imagining a path forward where Christendom has died and something new is being born, there has to be, as you were saying, Claye, I think the most important thing then has to be that individual and collective together honesty in deeply contemplative open prayer. Is that what you would all say? Is there another element of how we approach this that is essential? Am I missing something?
Imagine if we were all honest, and we were all safe enough to be vulnerable and to be honest with each other. I mean, really honest about about how we feel about things when we know that we shouldn't feel that way. I mean, how if we run in circles where we all are very contemplative and we believe in that way of being, however, really the way we're kind of practically living is not that, and we could then be truthful about that to those around us, and allow that kind of vulnerability to affect us and affect them, and then that's complemented with somebody else being honest. Imagine if we had beautifully honest and authentic communities.
Yep.
Actually, I like what you said right at the beginning about that. What if it was safe enough to be honest and vulnerable and everything? And I think this is another opposition between the concept of Christendom and communities that endure and actually promote flourishing and ownership. Is that there's actually a difference between a community of certainty and a community of safety, I think. One that says the answer and the place of belonging is only this, and the one that says, well, let's try out our theologies, let's try out what we think is true, let's try out being vulnerable with each other, knowing that we'll catch each other, knowing that we can change our minds, knowing that we are all infallible in this space, and that's okay because we're all fallible in this space, and that's okay because that's the only place that growth can happen.
Well, this is a perfect place to lead into the podcast, I think, for those who haven't heard it yet, because I think all of these themes, and I can imagine that these are the discussions you're having with other clergy, with friends, with your church communities as well. They're conversations that you would think would be happening in different parts of the world globally at the moment. And the podcast that we have recorded, Sue, Peter and myself, does explore some of these ideas as well in some other areas. But what seems clear is that to think this is a change that can be implemented in a new structure or a new program would be to fall victim to the very thing that we're talking about moving throughout here. So there has to be an acceptance, and I think we got to this point in the podcast as well as here. There's almost this point where the starting point has to be this acceptance that things such as mystery and patience and humility and committing to like a somewhat long journey is essential to discover this new way forward. We might leave the video there. I think we were going to go for about 20 minutes. So I think we've somewhat exceeded that. The conversation was so good that we've just kept on going. But it's been a pleasure to spend time with all of you via Zoom like this. We should do this again, I think, sometime.
Indeed, absolutely.
It'd be a lot of fun. So thank you so much, Deb and Clay, for making time. Thank you, Sue and Peter, as always. And you can check out the podcast wherever you do download podcasts. And stay tuned to the Facebook page. You'll see more from us shortly.